The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and Graham Hale read it 3 times before he allowed himself to believe it was real. He was sitting on the front step of the small house he had built with his own 2 hands on the eastern edge of his 14 acres in Colton Creek, Texas, a place where the sky stretched so wide a man could lose himself just looking at it. The morning air smelled of dry earth and the sweet rot of last autumn's grass, and somewhere far off a crow was calling to something it could not reach. Graham held the letter between his calloused fingers, careful not to crease the paper more than it already was from the journey it had taken, and he read the words again. Her name was Julia Shelton. She was 24 years old. She came from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where she had worked as a seamstress for 6 years following the death of her mother. She had no living brothers or sisters. She described herself as capable and unafraid of hard work, and she wrote that she was not coming west in search of adventure, but in search of something she had not yet had, which was a life that felt entirely her own. She had read Graham's advertisement in the Western Correspondence Journal 3 months ago, and she had taken her time thinking before she wrote. She was not impulsive. She wanted him to know that. Graham folded the letter along its original creases and slid it into the breast pocket of his shirt, close to his chest, and he sat there a moment longer looking out across his land. 14 acres did not sound like much to a man who had not worked it. To Graham, it was everything. He had come to Colton Creek at 26 years old with a mule, $40, and a dream that had no particular shape yet, only a direction. That had been 4 years ago. He was 30 now, with sun lines at the corners of his eyes and hands that never quite lost their roughness no matter how much he scrubbed them at the wash basin. He had cleared the eastern half of the acreage himself, pulling rocks and cutting brush until his back screamed at him every morning. He had planted a kitchen garden the first year, a modest wheat field the second, and this spring he had put in corn on the 3rd parcel. He had dug a proper well. He had chinked the gaps in the cabin walls and added a 2nd room with a window that faced west, so whoever slept there could watch the sun go down. He had built that 2nd room before he had sent the letter to the Correspondence Journal. He had not let himself examine that order of events too carefully. His neighbor, a weathered cowboy named Pete Aldridge who ran cattle on the land bordering Graham's north fence line, had been the one to tell him about mail-order arrangements. Pete was not a man who talked much, but when he did the words carried weight. He had told Graham over a shared supper one October night that a man building something alone was only building half of it, and that the other half required another person to want it too, and that wanting it together was what made it real. Pete had gotten his own wife that way, 15 years back, and they had 6 children and a house that had grown 3 additions and was still somehow not large enough. Graham had thought about Pete's words all winter. He had thought about them while he was mending fence in the cold, and while he was splitting wood in the dark before dawn, and while he was lying awake in the single room of his cabin listening to the wind come down from the north and shake the walls. And in January he had written the advertisement, and he had felt foolish doing it, and he had sent it anyway. Now it was April, and Julia Shelton had written back, and Graham needed to write a reply. He spent 3 days on that reply. He wrote drafts in a notebook he kept for accounting, crossing out lines and starting over until the notebook pages were a mess of false starts. He was not a man who lacked for words exactly, but he was a man who had learned early that saying the wrong thing was worse than silence, and he did not want to say the wrong thing to this woman who had described herself as not impulsive. He wanted to be honest. He told her the house was small but solid. He told her the land was good but demanding. He told her Colton Creek had a general store and a church and a doctor 2 towns over, and that the nearest city was a full day's ride by horse. He told her about the wheat and the corn and the kitchen garden. He told her about the well. And then, at the bottom of the page, after all the practical things were said, he wrote one sentence that he did not cross out. He wrote that he had built the second room of his house with a window facing west because he thought whoever lived in it ought to be able to watch the sun go down, and that he hoped she would find it worth the journey. He sent the letter the next morning before he could change his mind. 2 more letters passed between them over the following 6 weeks, and Graham found himself looking for the post rider with an eagerness that he recognized as something new and a little alarming. Julia's second letter was longer than her first. She told him about Harrisburg, about the smell of the textile mill where she had not worked but which had dominated the neighborhood, about the way the river looked in winter, about the boarding house where she had lived since her mother passed. She told him she had taught herself to read by age 7 from her mother's Bible, and that she had a habit of solving problems by thinking about them while she walked, and that in a city, there was never enough room to walk properly. She said she liked dogs but had never been allowed to keep one at the boarding house. She said that the western sky, which she had seen illustrated in newspapers, looked to her like a thing that would be hard to get used to, and that she suspected she would spend her first weeks simply standing outside staring at it. Graham read that part twice and smiled in a way that surprised him, a quiet private smile that no one was there to see. His third letter to her was shorter than his second, but it contained the formal invitation. He asked her if she would come. He told her he would arrange the train ticket from Harrisburg to San Antonio if she would send word of her dates, and that he would meet the stage at Colton Creek himself. He said he understood this was not a small thing and that he did not take it lightly, and that he hoped she knew he meant that. Her answer came in June. Yes, she would come. She would be on the westbound stage from San Antonio on the 14th of September. Graham set the letter on the table and looked around the inside of his cabin, which suddenly seemed smaller than it had that morning. He spent the summer working the land harder than he ever had, but also working the house. He whitewashed the interior walls. He built a proper table with 4 chairs instead of the 2 mismatched ones he had been using. He acquired a stove with 2 burners from the general store, replacing the single-burner cast iron he had managed on, and he ran the flue pipe himself with help from Pete Aldridge, who showed up uninvited on a Saturday with a length of pipe and his eldest son, and did not say much about it but grinned when the stove drew well on the first test fire. Graham built a wardrobe for the second bedroom and cut a shelf along the wall beneath the west-facing window, where a person might put books or small things, and he hung a curtain over the window from a length of pale blue cotton he bought at the general store, and felt self-conscious about all the way home. He also went in late August to speak with Reverend Marsh at the Colton Creek Church, which was a 1-room white building at the edge of town that had been built 4 years earlier and was already showing the strain of the climate in its planking. Reverend Marsh was a tall, thin man from Ohio who took the spiritual temperature of Colton Creek seriously, and who had, in Graham's limited observation, a surprisingly good instinct for when people needed practical advice rather than scripture. Graham explained the situation plainly. Reverend Marsh listened without interrupting, and then said that he would be happy to perform a ceremony when the time came, and that he would ask no more questions than necessary. Graham thanked him and rode home and stood at the fence line that separated his corn field from the open range beyond, looking at the sky going orange in the west, and tried to understand what he was feeling. It was not exactly fear and not exactly excitement. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and knowing that once you stepped off, the only way forward was to keep moving. September came in a rush of dry heat and high wind. Graham watched the calendar with a focus that was entirely unlike his usual relationship with time, which was loose and governed more by weather and crop stage than by date. On the 12th, he drove his wagon into Colton Creek to check that he had supplies enough, and the storekeeper, a broad, cheerful man named Horace Dunbar, raised an eyebrow at the quantity of flour and salt and coffee Graham bought. Graham said, "I have company coming." Horace Dunbar said, "Heard that. Heard she comes from Pennsylvania." He leaned on the counter. You know, my wife came from Ohio and she thought Texas was the end of the earth for the first 6 months. Then she started calling Ohio cramped. He bagged the flour. Women are adaptable things when given room to be. Graham appreciated that more than he said. On the morning of the 14th, he was up before the sun. He fed the mule and hitched the wagon and was on the road to the stage stop, which was in front of Dunbar's General Store. By the time the sky had shifted from black to the pale gray of early morning. He arrived 2 hours before the stage was due, and sat in his wagon with his hat in his hands, and tried not to think too precisely about what was about to happen. Pete Aldridge rode up at 9:30, having apparently decided that moral support was in order, which was a decision he had made without consulting Graham. He sat his horse beside Graham's wagon and pulled out a paper of tobacco and rolled himself a cigarette and said nothing for a long time, which was its own kind of comfort. "You look like a man waiting for a verdict," Pete said eventually. "That is more or less how it feels," Graham admitted. Pete lit his cigarette and squinted at the southern road. "It is going to be fine," he said, with the certainty of a man who had survived the same experience and come out better for it. "She wrote to you knowing what she was coming to. That is not nothing." The stage arrived at 11 o'clock in a clatter of hooves and dust, the driver calling out the stop before the wheels had fully stopped rolling. Graham was off the wagon before he had consciously decided to move, and he was standing in the road when the stage door opened and the passengers began to step down. He recognized her immediately, though he could not have said precisely how. She was not the tallest woman he had ever seen, nor the shortest. She was wearing a gray traveling dress that had done some miles with her, and a hat with a small brim that had been jostled sideways, and which she was straightening with one hand as she stepped down. She had dark brown hair pinned under the hat and eyes that were, he discovered when she looked up, a shade between green and brown that he had not expected and could not stop looking at. She was carrying a brown leather bag in one hand, and had a larger trunk being handed down from the stage roof by the driver's assistant. She looked at the town, which was one street and a handful of buildings, and then she looked at Graham, and something in her expression shifted from uncertainty to determination, and she walked toward him with her chin up. "Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that made him suspect she had practiced at being steady. "Miss Shelton," he said. He took off his hat and held it at his side. "Welcome to Colton Creek." She looked at him for a moment with those hazel eyes that were taking in more than she was letting on, and then she said, "It is exactly as flat as I imagined." He blinked, and then he laughed, and it surprised them both. "I am sorry," she said, but she was almost smiling. "I did not mean it as a complaint." "It is flat," he agreed. "That is a fact." They stood there a moment in the September heat, the stage pulling away and the dust settling, and Pete Aldridge was still sitting on his horse nearby in a way that was not quite watching but was certainly present. Graham introduced them, and Pete touched his hat brim and said he was pleased to meet her, and then rode off in the direction of his own land with the tact of a man who knew when his presence had served its purpose. Graham helped load Julia's trunk into the wagon, and they drove out of town toward the 14 acres, and for the first several minutes neither of them spoke, which was not uncomfortable exactly but was charged with the weight of everything still to be said and decided. Julia spoke first. She pointed at a stand of mesquite along the roadside and asked what it was. He told her. She asked about the grass, which was brown and low. He told her it would come back greener after the rains in spring. She asked how far the house was. He said about 2 miles. She looked at the land spreading out on either side of the track, wide and unoccupied and bleached by summer, and he watched her watching it. "It is enormous," she said softly, and he was not sure if she meant it as a good thing or a frightening one, and then she added, "I can breathe out here," and he understood it was neither, it was simply true, and that she was the kind of person who said true things when she found them. The house came into view around a bend of willows that followed a seasonal creek, and Graham found himself watching Julia's face rather than the house, trying to read her reaction. She did not say anything right away. She looked at the cabin, which was modest and square, the whitewash bright in the afternoon sun, a kitchen garden visible along the south wall where the squash vines had gone sprawling past their bed. "You built this yourself," she said. It was not entirely a question. "Most of it," he said. "Pete Aldridge helped with the roof." She was quiet another moment, and then she said, "It is a good roof." He helped her down from the wagon and showed her the house. He showed her the stove and the table with its 4 chairs, and the shelves he had built along the kitchen wall. He showed her the second room with the blue curtain at the window. He stood in the doorway of that room while she went inside and walked to the window and looked west, where the sun was beginning its afternoon descent, and he watched her stand there with her hands at her sides and her hat still slightly crooked on her head, and the light fell through the pale blue curtain and turned everything the color of water. "You wrote about this window," she said without turning around. "I did," he said. "You were right," she said, and turned to look at him with something that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. It was worth the journey. He let out a breath he had been holding since the stage arrived. The first weeks were careful and courteous, and full of the particular effort of 2 strangers learning the grammar of each other's days. Julia rose early, which Graham had not expected, and was in the kitchen before him most mornings, and this felt significant to him in a way he could not fully articulate, as if the act of her being awake and present in his house before the sun came fully over the horizon made the house something different than it had been. She was, as she had claimed in her letter, unafraid of hard work. She took over the kitchen garden with a systematic energy that impressed him, fixing the sprawling squash, staking the remaining tomato plants, clearing a section for a fall planting of turnips and beets. She asked him practical questions about the soil and the well and the patterns of weather he had observed in 4 years on the land, and she listened to his answers with the focused attention of someone who intended to use the information. She also, in the evenings, read. She had brought 4 books in her brown leather bag, which seemed to Graham an entirely sensible ratio of clothing to books, and she sat at the table by the lamp after supper and read, while Graham worked on his accounts or mended tools or simply sat across from her, and if he was honest, watched her read without quite meaning to. She had a habit of tucking her chin down when she came to something that interested her, and her eyes moved quickly across the page, and sometimes her lips moved just faintly when she hit a particularly well-constructed sentence, as if she was tasting the words. He asked her once what she was reading, and she held up the cover, a collection of essays by an Eastern philosopher, which was not what he had expected, and she asked if he wanted to hear a passage, and he said yes before he had considered whether he was actually interested in Eastern philosophy, and she read a paragraph about the nature of small moments and their accumulative power, and it was, he thought afterward, possibly the best 2 minutes of his September. The formal arrangement of their lives at that point was still technically that of a man and his arranged bride-to-be, sharing a house but not yet married, sleeping in separate rooms with a particular care, paid to propriety that both of them observed without discussing it. Reverend Marsh had suggested that a proper ceremony be conducted within a month of her arrival, which Julia had agreed to when Graham relayed the suggestion, and both of them were aware of the date approaching without having yet developed the vocabulary to talk about what it meant beyond its practical components. It was the first argument that opened something between them, which was perhaps the way such things always worked. It happened in the 3rd week of October, over the corn harvest, which Graham had begun cutting with an urgency that Julia observed and then questioned. She had offered to help, and he had declined firmly, because the corn rows were uneven in places and the footing was not always reliable, and he did not want her to fall. Julia had accepted this once and then twice, and by the 3rd morning she had put on her working apron and come into the field anyway. He had told her it was not necessary. She had told him it was necessary because the weather was turning, and at his current pace, the outer rows would not be finished before the first frost. He had told her he knew the weather patterns of this land better than she did. She had told him that was certainly true and also beside the point, and had picked up a corn knife from the edge of the field where it was leaning against the fence post and started in on the outer row. They had worked in silence for nearly an hour before Graham said, without looking up from his row, "You are faster than I expected." Julia said, "Most things about me are different from what people expect." He thought about that while he worked. A little while later he said, "I should not have tried to keep you out of the field." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "I was concerned about your safety." "I appreciate the concern," she said. "Next time perhaps ask rather than decide." He looked at her across the corn stalks, at her face flushed with effort and her sleeves rolled past her elbows, and that direct look she gave him when she was making a point she considered important. "You are right," he said. She looked slightly surprised that he had said it so cleanly, and then the surprise softened into something warmer, and she nodded and went back to her row. That evening she cooked a beef stew that used the last of the onions from the garden, and it was very good, and they both knew the argument had not damaged anything but had in fact done the opposite, which was to establish a ground between them that felt more solid than courtesy alone. The wedding was on the 21st of October, a Saturday, in the Colton Creek church. It was attended by Pete Aldridge and his wife Margaret, who was a substantial, cheerful woman from Louisiana, who had taken to Julia with immediate warmth from their first meeting, and had shown up the day before the ceremony with a jar of preserved peaches as a gift, and the unstated intention of seeing that everything was organized properly. Horace Dunbar from the general store came with his wife. Two of the families from neighboring land came, the Reeds and the Santanas, bringing children who ran outside the church during the ceremony because they could not be expected to stand still, and their noise filtering through the white-painted walls was somehow not distracting but festive. Julia wore a dress she had brought from Harrisburg, made from dark blue wool with cream buttons at the collar, which she had clearly chosen before she left Pennsylvania knowing she would wear it for this purpose, which struck Graham as both practical and quietly moving. He wore his best shirt and his coat, which he had brushed twice, and his good boots, which he had polished the night before while Julia was reading in her room. Reverend Marsh conducted the ceremony with a simple gravity that suited the occasion. He read from Genesis and from Corinthians and said some words about the particular courage it took to build something from the beginning, and Graham was aware, standing there facing Julia with the whole small congregation behind them, that his hands were not shaking but wanted to. Julia's face during the ceremony was composed and serious, which he had expected, but her eyes were very bright, which he had not, and when Reverend Marsh asked her if she took this man she answered clearly and immediately without the slightest hesitation, and Graham felt that landing in his chest like something settling into its correct position after a long time of being slightly wrong. He said his own vows and meant every syllable. When Reverend Marsh said the words that made it final, Julia looked at Graham with those hazel eyes that were green in the church light, and something passed between them that did not require language, an acknowledgement that this was real, and that they both intended to honor it. And he thought later that it was the most honest moment he had experienced in many years. Margaret Aldridge wept openly and without apology. Pete passed her his handkerchief with the practiced efficiency of a long-married man. The celebration afterward was held outside, because the afternoon had gone warm in the way that October sometimes surprised you with in Texas, a false summer afternoon that made the day feel like a gift. There was food brought by the neighboring families, cornbread and venison pie, and Margaret's preserved peaches over pound cake, and Horace Dunbar had brought a jug of something that went unspecified but circulated freely among the men. Someone had a fiddle, a boy from the Reed family, 16 years old, who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but gave the gathering a sound that made it feel like something worth remembering. Julia danced once with Pete Aldridge, who moved with the stiff self-conscious dignity of a man who did not dance often but could not refuse a bride, and then she danced with Graham, and this was different from everything preceding it in the day, because it was the first time they had been physically close in any way that was not purely functional, and Graham was aware of her hand in his and the faint smell of the soap she used, and the way she followed his lead without losing anything of her own in it. "You can dance," she said, which sounded more like information than a compliment. "My mother made certain of it," he said. "She believed it was a basic human requirement." "She sounds sensible," Julia said. "She was," he said, and the past tense landed between them with the weight of something Julia understood without asking, and she pressed his hand slightly, which he felt long after the song ended. The days that followed the wedding were the most disorienting of Graham's life, and he meant that in the best possible sense. There was now a shared reality to his mornings that he did not know how to fully account for. Julia was his wife, and she lived in his house, and they ate their meals at the four-chair table, and the arrangement was completely real. And yet it was still so new that he kept having moments of looking up from his work and seeing her crossing the yard or standing at the stove and feeling an impact of surprise, as if each time he registered her presence it was slightly fresh. They learned each other in the way that people learn things they cannot approach directly, obliquely, through habit and small incident. He learned that she did not like to be spoken to in the first minutes after waking, which was not unfriendliness, but a need for quiet that he recognized and respected, because he had something like it himself. She learned that he had a way of working that involved absolute focus and brief complete rest, intense periods of effort followed by a 10-minute stillness during which he sat and looked at nothing with great concentration. And she stopped reading urgency into the stillness and began instead to bring him coffee during it, which became, over weeks, one of the rhythms of their days. He told her about his family one night in November, when they were sitting by the stove after supper, because the evenings had turned cold enough to merit the fire. His mother and father had come from Tennessee when Graham was 12. His father had died of fever when Graham was 19, leaving him and his mother on a tenant farm that was not theirs and required a landlord's goodwill to continue, and the landlord's goodwill had run out 2 years later, after his mother passed. Graham had spent a year working on other men's land before he decided that working for himself on 14 acres he owned outright was a better prospect than working for others on 300 acres he would never own. Julia listened to all of this with her chin in her hand and her eyes on the fire, and when he finished she said, "You are very determined." "I learned early that no one else was going to be determined on my behalf," he said. She looked at him then. "I know that feeling exactly," she said, and the quality of her voice told him that she was not speaking abstractly, and he waited, and she told him about her mother, who had been a quiet woman with a needle skill that kept them housed and fed in the years after Julia's father left when Julia was 8 years old. Her mother had not complained about this situation and had not made Julia feel its gravity, but Julia had understood it clearly by the time she was 12, and she had started taking sewing work of her own by 14, and by the time her mother died she had been supporting them both for 2 years already, and there had been no one to call upon afterward. "You told me in your first letter you wanted a life that felt entirely your own," Graham said. "Yes," she said. "Does this feel like that?" he asked. It was a genuine question he needed to know. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then she said, "It feels like a life we are making together, which I think might be better than one that is entirely my own." She paused. "I was not sure it would be when I wrote that letter. I only knew what I had lacked. I had not imagined what it might feel like to lack it differently." He watched her profile in the firelight, the small, precise features and the line of her jaw, and the way she thought in full sentences that she then delivered without softening them for comfort. And he thought he was in serious trouble, in the best possible way. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was harsher than the previous two had been, which was the unpredictable nature of West Texas weather. The temperature dropped sharply in December and stayed down through January, and Graham spent most of those weeks managing the livestock, which had been supplemented in November by 2 additional milk cows, and a flock of chickens that Julia had argued for, and which were now producing eggs at a rate that justified the argument completely. There were also 2 new pigs in a pen behind the house, which was Graham's contribution to the ongoing negotiation about which animals they could sustain. The confined quarters of the cold winter months, the 2 of them in the small house through long dark evenings, created a kind of warmth between them that was not only the warmth of the stove. They talked more than Graham had talked to anyone in years. Julia had opinions on every subject she had given attention to, which was most subjects, and she expressed them with a directness that he found, early on, occasionally startling and then increasingly necessary, like a window opened in a room that needed air. She asked him things he had not been asked before, not just practical questions, but considered ones, about what he wanted the 14 acres to look like in 10 years, what he thought about the land disputes that were occurring through much of Texas as large ranching operations pressed against smaller ones, whether he felt the isolation of the territory or whether it suited him. He told her it had suited him before, and that now it suited him differently, which she understood. He asked her things too. He asked about the books she read, and found that her answers opened doors into subjects he had not thought to enter. He asked about Harrisburg and found that she was able to describe it precisely, and with a particular dry wit that made him laugh, and he noted that she seemed surprised each time she made him laugh, as if she had not expected to be funny or had not been around people who found her so. "You are very funny," he told her one evening, plainly. She looked at him with an expression that was briefly unguarded. "My mother used to say that," she said, and then she looked away at her book, and he let it rest there, which was the right thing to do. In late January, a blizzard came through that lasted 3 days and left the ground white in a way that Graham had not seen since his first year on the land. He and Julia were entirely housebound for 2 days, and on the second day they played cards at the kitchen table with a battered deck he found in a tin under the bed, and she beat him at 3-card games in a row with a composure that was almost suspicious. "Where did you learn to play cards?" he asked. "The boarding house," she said, rearranging her hand. "There were 8 women living there and 6 months of Pennsylvania winter. You learned to entertain yourself." He won the 4th game, and she conceded with good grace, and then won the 5th. It was during that second day of the blizzard, the cards set aside and the stove working hard against the wind that was pressing against the walls, that Graham said something he had not planned to say. They were sitting close to the stove because the far end of the room had gone genuinely cold despite the chinking, and Julia was reading, and he was watching the fire through the grate, and he said, without turning to look at her, "I am glad you wrote back." She stopped reading. He could feel her stillness. "I almost did not," she said. "The second day after I received your advertisement, I nearly convinced myself that it was not a sensible thing to do." "What changed your mind?" he asked, and looked at her now. She held her book in both hands and looked at him with the direct, clear look that was entirely hers. "You wrote that you had built the room with the window," she said. "I do not know how to explain it exactly. It was not a large thing, but it was a thoughtful thing. And I thought that a man who thought to build a room with a window facing west for a woman he had never met might be worth writing back to." He looked at her for a long moment, and the fire shifted in the grate and the wind pressed the walls, and he said, "Julia," and stopped. "Yes," she said. He said, "I think I am in love with you." And then, because that seemed like it deserved more than just stating, he added, "I want you to know that it did not happen quickly for me. It happened the way land changes, a little at a time and then all at once." She looked at him with those eyes that were very bright again, as they had been in the church, and the book lowered to her lap. She said, "I know the feeling," and the way she said it was not merely affirming his experience but was her own declaration, wrapped in fewer words but no less complete, and he reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, and she turned her hand to hold his properly, and they sat like that by the stove while the blizzard worked the walls and the fire kept them warm. The spring of 1883 arrived with a generosity that felt almost like apology for the winter's severity. The rains came in March, good soaking rains that pulled the land out of its cold brown state and started the grass coming back in long, bright sweeps. Graham planted his fields with a renewed energy that had something to do with the weather and more to do with the fact that the land felt different to him now, not because it had changed, but because he was farming it for something more than himself, for the future they were building together, and that future had a shape now that it had lacked before. Julia had plans for the land that she had been working out over the winter in her quiet, thinking while walking way, and she presented them to Graham in April over the kitchen table, with a practical clarity that he had come to love about the way she organized her thoughts. She wanted to expand the kitchen garden significantly and sell produce to Horace Dunbar's store, which she had established through 2 conversations with Horace was a genuine market need in Colton Creek, where most families were too occupied with their primary farming or grazing operation to grow vegetables in quantity. She wanted to add a proper henhouse so the chickens could be managed better, and she thought they could sell eggs in town as well. Graham listened to all of this and looked at the sketch she had made of the expanded garden plot and said, "This is a good plan." She looked at him as if she had been prepared for more resistance. "You agree?" "I agree," he said. "I should tell you that I think you see the economic possibilities of this land more clearly than I have." "You see the agricultural possibilities," she said. "Between us, we have the whole picture." He thought that was one of the more beautiful sentences anyone had ever said to him, for reasons that were not exactly about agriculture. They built the henhouse together in May, which involved a creative disagreement about the roof pitch that lasted 3 days, and was resolved when Julia's design proved correct on the question of drainage, and Graham acknowledged it without resentment, which was a thing he had gotten better at over the months of their marriage. They worked well together physically, with a wordless efficiency that Pete Aldridge, who had wandered over one afternoon on the pretext of returning a borrowed post-hole digger, watched for a while, and then told Graham privately, was something it had taken him and Margaret 7 years to develop. The produce venture was successful from the first season. Julia negotiated the arrangement with Horace Dunbar herself, which Graham noted with a respect that had been growing in him since October and showed no signs of slowing. She brought the first load of produce to town in July in the wagon, green beans and squash and onions and beets, and Dunbar bought all of it and placed a standing weekly order, and said he had 3 families asking about eggs as soon as she had them to spare. On the drive back from that first sale, Julia held the coins from Dunbar's payment in her hand and looked at them for a moment, and then looked at Graham with an expression he did not immediately recognize and then understood was pride, not vanity, but the bone-deep satisfaction of a person who has done something with their own capability and seen it come to fruition. "This is what I meant," she said, "in the letter. About a life that felt entirely my own. And now," he said, "now I mean it differently," she said, and she curled the coins into her fist and looked at the road ahead, and she was smiling, which she did less openly than some people but more completely, so that when she smiled the whole thing arrived at once. He reached across the wagon seat, and she uncurled her hand, and took his, and they drove home that way, the July heat laying its broad, warm weight across everything, the land rolling away on either side of the track in shades of gold and green. In August, Julia told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning while he was at the stove pouring coffee, and he turned around and looked at her, and she was watching him with that careful, steady look she wore when she was saying something important. He set the coffee pot down and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her, and she held him back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" She said she was perfectly well. She said she had been to see Mrs. Aldridge, who had 6 children and could be considered an authority, and Margaret had told her she was healthy and had several months before the work of it really began, and that Margaret would help when the time came and knew a woman in Colton Creek who had some midwifery training. Graham held her slightly tighter. He said, "I want you to know that everything about this life we are building together matters to me. You most of all." She pulled back slightly to look at him. "You are going to be unbearable about this, aren't you?" she said, but she was smiling. "Quite possibly," he said, which made her laugh, which made him laugh, and the morning came through the kitchen window and lit everything. That fall Graham turned 31, and the 14 acres turned out its best harvest yet. The wheat had done well on the second parcel, and the corn on the third was a full third better than the previous year, which Graham attributed to the winter rains and Julia attributed to the improvement in his row alignment, and they agreed it was probably both. The kitchen garden had produced through the summer in quantities that kept Dunbar's store supplied, and left their own cellar stocked with preserved goods that Graham looked at in November with a feeling he recognized as security, which was something he had worked toward for 4 years but had never quite held until now. He thought often, in those autumn months, about his mother and father, about the tenant farm they had labored on without the protection of ownership, about the precarity that had characterized his early life, and he thought about what he was building here and what it would mean if they could hold it and grow it. And the thought of the child coming gave all of this an urgency and a tenderness that was entirely new. Pete Aldridge came over one October evening and sat with Graham on the front step after supper, the way he had done before any of this had happened, before the letters and the stage and the window with the blue curtain. The stars were very sharp and the air had the clean edge of approaching winter. Pete said, "You look like a different man than the one who had supper with me 2 years ago." Graham said, "I feel like one." Pete was quiet a moment. Then he said, "It is a good thing what you have built here, both the land and the rest of it." Graham looked at his 14 acres, dark in the evening, the fields cut down and the garden put to bed, and the henhouse solid along the south wall and the light from the kitchen window laying its yellow rectangle across the yard. He said, "I know." The winter of 1883 to 1884 was easier than the last one, or perhaps they were simply better prepared for it, with more fuel laid in and more food in the cellar. And this year, the particular warmth of 2 people in a house who had chosen each other and meant it. Julia's pregnancy advanced steadily, and she remained, as she had predicted she would, perfectly well through most of it, though by January her usual walking pace had been modified, and she had developed a habit of sitting by the west-facing window in the second room, which she now used as a sitting room in the afternoons, and looking out at the winter sky with an expression of such complete inner attention that Graham, passing the open door, sometimes felt as if he were glimpsing something private and profound. He had worried that the isolation of the place would wear on her more in winter and more in pregnancy, and he had asked her directly in December, which was the policy they had developed about things that mattered. She had said that the isolation was different from loneliness, and that she had been lonely in Harrisburg in ways she had not understood until she was not lonely anymore, and that the space of the land and the quiet of the evenings and the particular quality of a night sky without city light were things she would have been unable to imagine in Pennsylvania and now could not imagine giving up. He said, "You are certain?" She looked at him steadily. "Graham," she said, "I am one of the more certain people you will ever meet." He knew this was true. It was one of the things he loved best about her. Margaret Aldridge came in February, the month the baby was due, and took up informal residence in the Hale house in the last 2 weeks with an authority that no one questioned and a warmth that transformed the place. She taught Julia things about the final weeks, and she kept the stove going at all hours, and she talked constantly, in the comfortable way of a woman who had raised 6 children and found that talking made the waiting easier. And Julia listened and asked questions, and the 2 of them developed, in those 2 weeks, a friendship that ran deep enough to survive the rest of their lives. The baby came on the 8th of February, 1884, in the very early morning hours, with the midwife from town and Margaret both present and Graham outside in the cold yard, because Margaret had told him firmly that he was to be outside, and he had obeyed because arguing with Margaret Aldridge in February at 2 in the morning was not a contest a person could win. When Margaret came to the door and told him he could come in, he went inside and found Julia in their bed, pale and still and utterly composed, with a baby in the crook of her arm that was red-faced and very loud and absolutely real. Graham sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, at Julia's exhausted, brilliant face and the small, furious person she was holding, and he had no words for what he felt and did not try to find them. He put his hand on her face gently, and she leaned into it with her eyes closed. "A son," Margaret said from across the room, with immense satisfaction, as if she had personally arranged it. Graham looked at his son, who had stopped crying and was making smaller sounds now, investigating the world with his eyes in the unfocused way of the newly arrived. He looked at Julia. "Are you well?" he said, because it was always the first thing. "I am very well," she said. She opened her eyes and looked at him with a look that was so fully hers and so fully present that he felt it like a physical thing. "We are very well." They named the boy Thomas, for Graham's father. Graham wrote the name carefully in the family Bible that had been his mother's, Thomas Graham Hale, February 8, 1884, and then sat for a moment with the Bible in his hands in the kitchen, while the house was quiet around him, and considered what it meant to be writing a name in a book that would carry it forward. The seasons after Thomas's birth arranged themselves with a new domestic rhythm that was fuller and louder and more demanding, and better than anything that had come before it. Julia returned to the kitchen garden in the spring with Thomas in a carrier she had fashioned that kept him against her chest while she worked, and she was back at her full productivity within a month in a way that impressed even Margaret Aldridge, who had high standards. Thomas turned out to be a child of considerable personality, which manifested early as a determined curiosity about everything in his immediate environment, which included the chickens, which he regarded with the greatest suspicion. Graham taught himself, in that first year of fatherhood, how to work with a child in the picture. He brought Thomas out to the field with him when he was big enough to sit and be interested, setting him in a shaded spot with things to investigate, and Thomas watched his father work with an attention that sometimes felt, to Graham, like something he would need to live up to. He talked to the boy while he worked, about the land and the weather and the crop stages, which Julia said was probably premature education, but which she observed with a look on her face that she did not bother to hide. In 1885, a problem arrived that required a different kind of attention. A cattle operation had been expanding along the western edge of the county for 2 years, owned by a man named Rowan Dodd, who had come to Texas with significant eastern capital and significant contempt for the smaller land operations that had preceded him. Dodd ran a few hundred head and had purchased 3 neighboring properties in the previous 18 months. In March of 1885, a rider arrived at Graham's fence line with a letter from Dodd's lawyer, offering to buy the 14 acres at a price that was approximately 60% of what the land was actually worth. Graham read the letter twice and handed it to Julia, who read it once. "No," she said. "No," he agreed. The difficulty was that Dodd's operation had been, in the way of men with capital and legal resources, gradually encroaching on the informal water rights that smaller operations in the area depended on. There was a creek that ran seasonal water across the northeast corner of Graham's land and through the properties of 2 other neighbors, and Dodd had filed a claim on the upstream section of that creek that, if upheld, would affect the downstream flow in dry months. This was not an uncommon situation in Texas in 1885. The land dispute era in the territory was producing exactly this kind of pressure on small landowners, and it was one of the genuine injustices of the time that the law often favored those with the resources to navigate it, and the smaller operations were left to manage as best they could. Graham had seen it happen to a family 2 towns over, the Garretts, who had lost their water access after a legal fight they could not sustain and had eventually sold at a loss and left the territory. Graham was not going to leave the territory. He spent 2 weeks in April talking to neighbors, the Reeds and the Santanas, and 2 other families whose land backed onto the same watershed, and he found that all of them had received similar letters from Dodd's lawyer, and all of them had the same reaction. The problem was that individual resistance was ineffective, and they did not have the combined resources for a proper legal engagement. It was Julia who found the solution, characteristically, through a combination of research and talking to people who knew things. She had started corresponding with a land rights association in San Antonio that had been formed specifically in response to the encroachment tactics being used by large cattle operations across West Texas. The association had a lawyer named Ellis who had taken cases on a sliding fee basis and had won 2 significant water rights rulings in the previous year. She presented this information to Graham one evening at the kitchen table with a stack of letters and a map she had drawn of the watershed area based on Graham's descriptions and what she had learned from Horace Dunbar, who knew the land history of the region going back 20 years. "You have been busy," Graham said, looking at the map. "I do not like being pressured," she said, "and I particularly do not like it being done to people who have less resources to fight back." He looked at her across the table, at the careful anger in her face that was not hot but was very steady. 14 acres and a fight on behalf of the whole watershed, he said. "We are not the only ones at risk," she said simply. "If Dodd gets the upstream claim and the dry season comes in hard, the Santanas lose their water access before we do. They have been here longer than either of us." He thought about the Santana family, whose patriarch Miguel had worked this land for 16 years and whose 2 sons had grown up helping him run it, and he thought about the injustice of a man with Eastern money and a lawyer being able to threaten that with a letter. "Write to Ellis," he said. She had already written. The process that followed was months long and unglamorous and full of paperwork and 2 trips to San Antonio, one of which Graham made alone in June, and one in September that he and Julia made together, leaving Thomas with Margaret Aldridge, who declared it a holiday and fed him a quantity of pound cake that took him 2 days to recover from. The lawyer Ellis was a sharp, quiet man who knew the watershed laws of the territory precisely and who had, in the 2 water rights cases, he had established arguments that applied directly to their situation. There were 6 families involved in the joint claim by the time Ellis filed it in July 1885. The legal process moved with the grinding slowness that characterized such things, but Dodd's lawyer filed a motion that was denied in August, which was the first indication that their position was stronger than the initial offer had implied. And in November, a ruling came from the district court that upheld the downstream water rights of all 6 properties, and placed restrictions on Dodd's upstream usage during dry months that rendered his original claim largely ineffective. Dodd did not attempt to purchase any of the 6 properties again. Graham came home from Horace Dunbar's store, where he had read the news from the territorial paper 2 days after the ruling, and found Julia in the kitchen garden with Thomas, who was 21 months old and deeply interested in a beetle he had located under a turnip leaf. Graham stood at the gate of the garden and looked at his wife and his son in the October afternoon light, and he said, "It is over. The ruling held." Julia looked up at him. Something crossed her face that was relief and satisfaction, and something else he could not name, and then she straightened and came to the garden gate, and he opened it, and she came through, and he put his arms around her and held her. "All 6 properties," she said into his shoulder. "All 6, he confirmed. She held on for another moment and then pulled back and looked at him. "I am glad," she said, and there was so much in it, not just about the water rights but about the whole shape of what they had built and what they had defended, that he simply nodded. Thomas, observing them from the turnip row with the detached interest of a child who did not yet entirely understand what adults became emotional about, held up the beetle for their inspection. "That is an excellent beetle," Julia told him. Thomas considered this and then put the beetle back under the leaf, which seemed like the correct thing to do with excellent things. The years that followed laid themselves down with the particular quality of time that is both full and swift, each season distinct in itself, and yet joining the others in a continuity that began to feel, to Graham, like the life he had been building toward all along without having known its specific shape. The 14 acres continued to develop. In 1886, he added a proper barn to replace the Linta structure that had housed his mule and the milk cows in insufficient conditions, and Pete Aldridge came with his 2 eldest sons to help with the framing, and they put the barn up in 3 days of concentrated effort that left everyone satisfied and tired. Julia's produce operation had by 1886 expanded into something more formal, a twice-weekly supply arrangement with Dunbar's store, and a standing order from a hotel that had opened in Colton Creek that year, as the town grew gradually, with the expansion of the rail connection to San Antonio. She had also, with characteristic directness, started teaching 2 of the neighboring women what she knew about maximizing yield in the kitchen garden, sharing seed stock, and the knowledge she had accumulated through reading and experiment. And these arrangements had the informal quality of friendship, but the practical effect of a network. Thomas grew. He was a serious child with an inquisitive nature that expressed itself in a constant stream of questions about how things worked, and why the sky changed colors, and where the beetles went in winter. By the time he was 3, he was following Graham around the farm with an attention that was both touching and occasionally inconvenient, since he had his mother's directness, and would ask, in the middle of the most demanding moments, why something was being done in the particular way it was being done. Graham answered every question with the seriousness it deserved, which was a decision Julia observed, and which she told him privately one evening was one of the things she loved most about him. "He needs to understand things," Graham said. "He will not be able to care for this land if he does not understand it." "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I see it." He looked at her over the kitchen table, this woman who had come from Pennsylvania with 4 books and a brown leather bag, and a spine of pure determined iron, this woman who had become the other half of everything he had built here, and he felt something so large and settled, and real that he did not try to put it into words, but simply reached across the table, and she reached back. In the spring of 1887, Julia told him she was expecting again. She told him in the kitchen again, in the morning again, and he set down the coffee pot again and held her again, and she laughed at the repetition of it, which was a good sound that filled the kitchen and went through the walls into the March morning. "I am glad," he said. "I know," she said, which was something she said to him often now, which meant that his feelings had become legible to her in a way that was entirely mutual, that she was equally legible to him, that they had learned each other so thoroughly that the words were sometimes just the formal confirmation of what was already understood. The second pregnancy was similar to the first in Julia's characteristic thoroughness about her own well-being, and she continued working through the spring and into summer with the modifications that practicality required. And she had long since established with Margaret Aldridge the arrangement for the birth that involved Margaret appearing at the house with authority and sending Graham outside, which Graham accepted as the established procedure. The second baby came in November 1887, a girl this time, born in the cold with the stove going full and Margaret's voice steady and assured through the walls, and when Graham came inside, she was wrapped in the blanket Julia had made during the winter evenings of the previous year, red-faced and considerably calmer than Thomas had been as a newborn, with a look of such composed observational interest that both parents and Margaret all commented on it. They named her Clara, for Julia's mother. Thomas, who was 3 years and 9 months old, was brought in to meet his sister by Graham and stood at the bedside regarding her with the concentrated assessment of a very young person encountering something entirely new. Then he looked at Graham and said, "Is she staying?" Graham said, "Yes." Thomas considered this with his mother's evaluative steadiness and then said, "All right," and went back to the kitchen where he had left a wooden horse he was interested in. Julia watched this from the bed with exhausted amusement and said, "He is going to be interesting." "He already is," Graham said. Margaret, from her position near the stove, said with complete contentment, "Every one of them is interesting. That is the thing about children. They are always interesting." Clara Hale turned out, in the months following her arrival, to be a person of considerable temperament concealed within apparent composure, which became clear the moment she was old enough to express preferences. She had strong opinions about everything within her reach, expressed them clearly and early, and by the time she was 1 she had established a communication with Thomas that operated on a frequency Graham and Julia could observe but not always translate, a brother and sister shorthand that seemed to have developed itself. The household in the spring of 1888 had a fullness that was sometimes loud and always alive, and Graham, who had been a solitary man on 14 acres 4 years before this, found that the fullness was the best thing he had ever built, more than the barn or the expanded fields or the successful harvest or the water rights victory, better than all of it, because it was not infrastructure, it was life. And it had the quality of something that would continue to grow in ways he could not predict and did not need to. He and Julia had developed, over 6 years of marriage, the kind of ease with each other that people sometimes mistake for the absence of feeling, but which is actually its mature and settled form. They knew each other's rhythms and needs and limits and strengths with a precision that had come from years of paying attention, and this knowing was not the end of discovery, but the foundation of it, because there was always something new to learn about a person if you were paying the right kind of attention, and they both were. Julia had begun writing. This was something she had not mentioned to Graham until she had been doing it for several months, not from secrecy, but from the same reason she had kept most of her developing plans to herself until she knew they were real, which was that she was not impulsive and did not speak about things until she was certain of them. She was writing about the practical realities of small land management in the West Texas climate, drawing on what she had learned in the kitchen garden and the produce operation and the water rights fight. And she had sent 3 pieces to a publication in San Antonio that ran articles about frontier homesteading, and all 3 had been accepted and paid for. She told Graham about this one evening in June 1888, setting 3 published pages on the kitchen table in front of him with the calm of someone presenting a completed project. He read them. He read them carefully and then he set them down and looked at her. "You wrote these," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are excellent," he said, and meant it precisely and completely. She looked at him with the look she had that was the closest she came to outright happiness, the full open smile that did not happen constantly, but when it did was entirely complete. The editor asked if I would write 3 more, about water management and the economic aspects of produce selling to small stores. "You should write them," he said. "I intend to," she said. He thought about the woman who had arrived on the September stage in 1882 with a brown leather bag and 4 books and a spine of determined iron, and he thought about who she was now in 1888, and he understood that they were the same person at different stages of becoming, and that the becoming had not stopped and was not going to, and that he loved this fact with the same depth that he loved everything else about her. Colton Creek had grown in the years of their marriage in ways that were measurable and others that were not. There was now a second general store, a proper school, a doctor who had settled permanently rather than requiring a day's ride to the next town, a post office separate from Dunbar's, and a population that had roughly doubled from when Graham had first broken ground on his 14 acres. The railroad connection to San Antonio had brought a class of travelers through who sometimes stayed, and who had added a new character to the town that mixed with the existing homesteader and ranching community in ways that were not always frictionless, but were generally productive. Graham had, by 1889, become something of an informal authority on land management in the area, partly through his reputation in the water rights case, and partly through the accumulated knowledge of 7 years of working his particular stretch of soil. He was consulted by newcomers and sometimes by established neighbors, and he answered questions with the directness he had learned was the most useful thing, and he occasionally directed people to Julia, who had by now published 8 pieces in the San Antonio publication, and had a correspondence with 2 other land management writers that was both professional and friendly. He found during this period that the shape of his original dream had been correct in its fundamentals and insufficient in its imagination. He had wanted 14 acres and a life built on them that was his own. What he had was 14 acres and a life built on them that was theirs, and the difference between those two things was so enormous that the original vision seemed now like a sketch compared to the completed thing. Thomas, at 5, had started attending the Colton Creek school, which he approached with the intensity he brought to everything, and came home with questions that were more complicated than the school could entirely address, and which kept Graham and Julia up past their usual hour on some evenings working through the answers. Clara, at 2, had developed a working relationship with the chickens that she considered a personal friendship, and which the chickens appeared to tolerate. In the summer of 1889, Pete Aldrich came over on a hot August afternoon and sat with Graham under the shade of the big mesquite near the barn and drank water from the well that Julia brought out, cold from the stone casing. And Pete said, looking out at the 14 acres, now all under some form of productive use, the fields and the garden and the henhouse and the barn, the house whitewashed fresh that spring with Thomas's help. You remember when this was all broke land and a dream and a mule. I remember, Graham said. It looks like something now, Pete said, in the way of a man who did not give compliments carelessly. Graham looked at his land and then at the house, where he could see through the kitchen window Julia at the table writing, her head bent down in the way it went when something she was working on had caught fully, the blue curtain moving at the west window in the afternoon heat. It is something now, he said. It has been for a while. Pete drank his water and was quiet a moment. Then he said, You know, I told you it was going to be fine. When you were sitting in that wagon outside Dunbar's looking like a verdict was coming. You did, Graham said. Was I right? Pete said. Graham watched the curtain move at the west window. He thought about the letter in the breast pocket of a different shirt, long since worn out and replaced, the letter he had read 3 times before believing it was real. He thought about a woman stepping off a stage with her hat slightly crooked and looking at the flat land, and saying what was entirely true about it. He thought about cards in a blizzard and a cornfield argument and vows said in a white-painted church, and a baby held in exhausted arms and water rights won by 6 families together, and 8 published pieces, and the full arrival smile that did not happen constantly, but when it did was entirely complete. You were right, he said. Pete nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already known. The autumn of 1889 brought a harvest that exceeded anything the 14 acres had produced before, the result of the soil improvements Graham had worked at systematically for years, and the weather pattern that had cooperated with generous spring rains and a dry harvest season. The wheat and corn came off the fields clean, and the kitchen garden's last summer planting gave yield into October, and the cellar filled in a way that suggested security for the winter ahead without question. Julia submitted 2 more pieces to the San Antonio publication, and received a letter from an agricultural journal in Austin that had read her work and wanted to discuss a regular contribution. She told Graham about this at the kitchen table, and he said, without any pause, You should write to them today. She looked at him with the evaluating look and then the warm one, and she said, I will write to them today. Thomas, returned from school that October afternoon, sat at the other end of the table doing his sums with a pencil that needed sharpening and periodically looked up to assess the general situation, which he apparently found satisfactory, because he went back to his sums without comment. Clara, on the kitchen floor with a collection of smooth stones she had brought in from the yard, was explaining something to the stones in a serious murmur that may or may not have been language. Graham sat at the kitchen table and looked at his family in the October afternoon light, at Julia writing with her chin down, and Thomas frowning at arithmetic and Clara conducting proceedings with the stones, and the stove warm and the light through the west-facing window coming in at the angle that meant the day was getting on but had not finished yet. And he held all of it for a moment in his attention the way you hold a handful of something precious, carefully, aware of its weight. He thought about 14 acres and one dream and the letter that had changed the shape of everything. And he thought about what it meant to build something real, not with ambition alone but with another person. With the daily accumulated weight of shared work and shared argument, and shared cold and shared joy, and shared grief and shared laughing over cards in a blizzard and shared reading of philosophy by lamplight and shared standing in the cornfield arguing about the correct approach, and ultimately understanding that you were both right about different parts of the same thing. He thought about what Pete had said, that a man building something alone was only building half of it. The house was entirely full. The land was entirely cared for. The family was entirely real, and it was theirs, and it would be here after them, in the land records and in the soil amendments and in the published pieces, and in the name written in his mother's Bible, and in everything Thomas would carry forward about how to ask the right questions, and everything Clara would carry forward about how to proceed with composure and strong opinions, and not apologize for either. That evening, after the children were asleep, and the supper dishes were done, and the stove was banked for the night, Graham and Julia sat on the front step of the house in the October dark, which in West Texas was enormous and completely populated with stars. The air was cool and clean with the smell of turned earth and dry grass, and somewhere distant a coyote was calling, and the land stretched out in every direction with the vast unconcerned patience of something that would outlast everything. Julia had her shawl around her and was leaning slightly against Graham's arm, and he had his arm around her, and they were both looking at the stars in the way of people who had the time for it and the patience for it and the particular quality of being fully present together that is the accumulated result of years of choosing each other. Julia said, "Do you know what I thought when I first stepped off that stage?" "That it was flat," he said. "After that," she said, and he could hear she was smiling. "What?" He said. She was quiet a moment looking at the stars. "I thought that either this was going to be the greatest mistake I ever made or the best decision, and that the only way to find out was to see it through." She paused. "And I thought that if the man waiting looked like someone worth seeing it through with, I would feel less uncertain." "And did he?" Graham said. He kept his voice even. "He did," Julia said. "He was holding his hat at his side, which I found somehow reassuring." A man who holds his hat at his side when he is nervous is a man being honest about the nervousness. "I thought that was a good sign." He laughed softly. "I was extremely nervous." "I know," she said. "So was I. I was just quieter about it." He held her slightly closer. The coyote called again in the distance and was answered from somewhere farther off, and the stars stayed where they were, indifferent and brilliant, and the 14 acres sat quiet and full of everything they had put into them. "Julia," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for writing back," he said. She lifted her face and looked at him in the stardark, and her eyes were the hazel that was sometimes green and sometimes something else, and her face was the face he knew better than any landscape and which still, somehow, had the quality of being new to him in the right moments, and she said, "Thank you for building the room with the window." He kissed her in the October night on the front step of the house he had built with his hands and his hope, and she kissed him back with the full measure of 7 years of a life chosen, and kept and grown into something neither of them had known to imagine on the day the letter arrived, and the stars spread their cold, brilliant light across 14 acres and everything on them. And the dream that had once been small and singular was now large and shared and entirely, permanently real. The spring of 1890 came in with the kind of green that followed a good rain winter, the kind of green that made even people who had lived on the land for years stop what they were doing and simply look at it. Thomas Hale, now 6 years old, walked out to the south field with his father in the first week of March and helped press seed into the prepared rows with the gravity of a boy who understood that this was important work, patting the soil down after each seed with the deliberate care that was entirely his mother's manner of doing things. Clara, 3.5, had been left at the house with Julia on the understanding that she would be allowed to help with the kitchen garden planting later in the week, which she was monitoring with vigorous attention. Graham walked his rows in the early morning light and watched his son work, and he thought about the first spring he had planted on this land alone, the single-person effort of it, the hope that had no witness. He thought about planting this spring with Thomas beside him, and Julia's kitchen garden coming alive along the south wall, and Clara's supervision of the chickens ensuring the flock was sufficiently organized. And he understood that the dream he had carried alone for those first years had not been wrong. It had simply been incomplete, because a dream is always incomplete until it meets the people who make it real. He looked at Thomas, who was pressing seed into the row with total concentration, and said, "Good work." Thomas looked up with his mother's straight, clear look and said, "How deep is exactly right?" "An inch," Graham said. "You are doing it exactly right." Thomas nodded and went back to work, satisfied. Julia came out at mid-morning with coffee and cornbread in a cloth, and she stood at the edge of the field and called, and they both came to her, Graham and Thomas, the man and his son, walking the same way across the turned earth, and she handed each of them their share and looked at the field and said, "It looks good." "It does," Graham said. He watched her face as she looked at the land, the practical assessment that was always the first thing, and then behind it the something else, the satisfaction that was not about yield or economics, but about the bare fact of a thing growing out of care and effort. And he thought she was the most beautiful thing on 14 acres, and that was saying something because he had always thought his land was beautiful. "You are staring," she said without looking at him. "I am," he said without apology. She looked at him then, and he saw the full smile arrive, the complete one that did not happen constantly, and it landed on him the way it always did, which was entirely. Thomas, eating cornbread and regarding this exchange with his usual assessing attention, said, "Can we plant the corn tomorrow?" "Day after," Graham said. "All right," Thomas said, and finished his cornbread with the efficiency of a person who had somewhere to be. The 14 acres stretched out in the March morning, the soil dark and ready, the kitchen garden showing the first green of early spring plantings, the barn solid and the henhouse active, and the house with its white walls bright in the new season light, and its west-facing window catching the morning in a way that made it glow. It was everything Graham Hale had dreamed of, and all the things he had not known to dream of. And it was full of the life he and Julia had built together from a letter and a hope and a room with a window facing west. And it would go on being full and being built and being theirs. That was the nature of the best things, Graham thought, standing in the spring morning on his land with his wife beside him and his son in the row, and his daughter's voice audible from the direction of the henhouse, where she was apparently conducting a serious review of the flock. The best things did not end. They only deepened and widened and grew more completely into what they had always been trying to be. He stood there in the March light and let it all be exactly what it was. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.